Have you ever wondered if one of the worst famines in history could have been made much worse by human decisions? Millions of people died in India during World War II. Some people believe it was only because of bad weather and crop failure. Others argue that the choices made by the British government turned a terrible food shortage into a massive human disaster. Even today, historians continue to debate how much responsibility belongs to Britain's wartime leaders, especially Winston Churchill. By the end of this video, you will understand why this event is still one of the most discussed chapters in modern history, what really happened, and why people around the world are still asking difficult questions more than 80 years later. The year was 1943. World War II was changing the world. Europe was on fire. Germany was expanding across the continent. Japan had taken control of large parts of Asia. Every major power was focused on winning the war. At the same time, far away from the battlefields of Europe, millions of ordinary people in Bengal, a region in eastern India, were fighting a different battle. Their enemy was hunger. At first, everything did not look like a disaster. Farmers continued working in their fields. Markets were open. Families hoped the difficult times would soon pass. But slowly, food became harder to find. Prices increased almost every week. Rice, the main food for millions of people, became too expensive for poor families. Workers who earned the same amount of money suddenly found they could buy only half the food they needed. Many people believed the shortage was caused by nature. A cyclone had hit parts of Bengal in 1942. Flooding damaged crops in several areas. A plant disease also affected some rice harvests. These events certainly created problems, but many historians say these natural disasters alone were not enough to explain why millions eventually died. The war itself had changed everything. Japan had captured Burma, which was one of India's biggest sources of imported rice. Almost overnight, millions of tons of food disappeared from the normal supply chain. The British government feared that Japan might invade eastern India next. To prepare for that possibility, officials introduced emergency military policies. One of the most controversial decisions was known as the denial policy. Boats along the Bengal coast were taken away or destroyed so that Japanese forces could not use them if they invaded. Thousands of small boats disappeared. On paper, the plan looked like a military precaution. In reality, these boats were the lifeline of local communities. Farmers used them to transport rice. Fishermen depended on them for food. Traders carried supplies between villages. Without the boats, moving food became much more difficult. Another decision involved removing large stocks of rice from areas considered vulnerable to invasion. The goal was to prevent enemy forces from finding supplies. But these actions also reduced food available for local civilians. Markets became unstable. Rumors spread quickly. People started buying extra food because they feared shortages. This panic buying pushed prices even higher. As food prices exploded, wealthy families could still afford rice. Poor laborers could not. A farmer might have food stored at home, but a factory worker or a fisherman depended on buying rice every single day. Once prices doubled and then tripled, many families had no chance of keeping up. Reports describing hunger began reaching local officials. At first, some leaders believed the situation would improve naturally. They expected the next harvest to solve the problem. Unfortunately, the crisis kept growing. Every week brought more hungry people into towns and cities looking for help. Calcutta, now called Kolkata, became one of the centers of the tragedy. Thousands of starving men, women, and children filled the streets. Many had walked for days from villages where no food remained. Parents searched desperately for anything their children could eat. Hospitals became crowded. Relief centers struggled to keep up. One of the biggest questions historians continue asking is whether enough food actually existed within the British Empire to help Bengal. Some researchers argue that ships carrying grain could have been redirected. Others point out that wartime shipping was under enormous pressure because supplies were needed across many battlefronts. Ships were constantly threatened by German submarines. Every government involved in the war faced impossible choices about where limited resources should go. This brings us to Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister during the war. Churchill is remembered by many people as the leader who inspired Britain to resist Nazi Germany. His speeches became symbols of courage, but his role during the Bengal famine remains one of the most controversial parts of his legacy. Historical documents show that Churchill and his cabinet received reports about the famine. Historians disagree about how much information reached him, how quickly decisions could have been made, and whether different actions would have saved many lives. Some cabinet records show officials discussing requests for food shipments. Some requests were approved later than critics believed necessary. Other requests were rejected because military needs were given priority. Another reason Churchill receives criticism comes from comments attributed to him in government records. Several historians argue that some of his remarks about India reflected racial prejudice common in parts of the British Empire during that period. Supporters of Churchill respond that many quotations lack important context and that wartime pressures influenced every major decision being made. The debate has continued for decades because historians examine the same documents but sometimes reach different conclusions. One group argues that British wartime policies greatly increased the death toll. Another group believes natural disasters, Japanese expansion, inflation, transportation problems, and wartime shortages all combined into a crisis that no single decision could fully prevent. What almost everyone agrees on is the human cost. Families were destroyed, children lost their parents, villages emptied as people searched for food elsewhere. Disease spread quickly because starving bodies could no longer fight infection. By the time the famine ended, modern estimates often place the death toll at around 3 million people, although exact numbers remain uncertain because record keeping during the crisis was incomplete. Many eyewitnesses left heartbreaking descriptions. They wrote about children sleeping beside roads because they were too weak to walk. They described mothers skipping meals so their children could eat. Some families sold everything they owned just to buy a little rice. When their money was gone, they had nothing left to trade. The tragedy also changed politics across India. Many Indians believed the colonial government had failed to protect its own people. Trust continued to decline. Calls for independence grew even stronger during and after the war. For many families, the famine became proof that decisions affecting millions of Indians were being made by leaders living thousands of miles away. As the famine became worse, pressure started building on the British government from many directions. Local officials, journalists, doctors, and relief workers were sending reports that described an emergency unlike anything they had seen before. They warned that people were not only dying from hunger, but also from diseases that spread quickly among weak and malnourished people. One of the biggest problems was that the food crisis did not affect everyone in the same way. Rich families could still buy rice even though the price was much higher than before. Large businesses and military suppliers were often able to secure food through government contracts, but poor workers, farmers with little land, fishermen, and daily wage laborers had almost no protection. Every day they earned just enough money to feed their families. Once food prices rose beyond their reach, they had no backup plan. Many people started selling everything they owned. First went jewelry, then farming tools, then household items. Some families even sold the doors and windows from their homes just to buy another small bag of rice. But after a few weeks, there was nothing left to sell. Hunger became impossible to escape. Thousands of people left their villages and walked toward larger cities, hoping someone would help them. Many believed food would be available in government camps or relief centers, but when they arrived, they found thousands of other desperate people waiting in long lines. Relief workers tried their best, but the number of hungry people kept growing every single day. Photographs taken during the famine shocked many people who later saw them. Children with extremely thin bodies sat quietly beside roads. Mothers held babies who were too weak to cry. Elderly people rested under trees because they no longer had the strength to continue walking. These images would later become some of the strongest reminders of the disaster. At the same time, the British government was completely focused on winning World War II. Every decision was connected to the war effort. Ships carried soldiers, weapons, fuel, and supplies across the world. Military leaders argued that if Britain lost the war, the situation would become even worse for millions of people living under the threat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Because shipping was limited, every request for food had to compete with military needs. Historians still debate whether more ships could have been used to send grain to Bengal. Some researchers believe there was enough food elsewhere in the British Empire and that faster action could have saved many lives. Others argue that shipping shortages were real and that moving grain safely across oceans during wartime was far more difficult than it appears today. Another important question involves Australia. Some historians point out that Australia had grain available during this period. Critics argue that larger shipments should have been sent to India much earlier. Defenders of the British government answer that finding ships, protecting them from enemy attacks, and deciding where limited cargo space should go were extremely difficult wartime decisions. The debate becomes even more complicated because food existed in some parts of India while other areas suffered terrible shortages. Transporting food across such a large country was already difficult. The loss of boats in Bengal and pressure on the railway system made distribution even harder. In some places, food remained in storage while nearby communities struggled to survive. There was also another problem that made the crisis much worse: fear. When people believe food will disappear, they often begin buying more than they normally need. Merchants sometimes hold supplies back, expecting prices to rise even further. Wealthier families purchase extra grain for security. All of these actions reduce the amount of food available in markets. As supplies become smaller, prices rise again. This creates a cycle that becomes harder to stop. Many economists believe this happened during the Bengal famine. They argue that while food production had certainly fallen, panic, speculation, and market failures caused prices to increase much faster than ordinary families could handle. The British government eventually increased relief efforts. More food was distributed, feeding centres expanded, medical support improved, but many historians argue these measures came too late. By the time large-scale assistance reached many communities, countless people had already died. The famine slowly began to ease in 1944 as better harvests arrived and more relief reached affected areas. But the damage had already been done. Entire families had disappeared. Thousands of children had lost their parents. Villages that once supported themselves were left empty. After the war ended, people began asking difficult questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Were government leaders too slow to respond? Did wartime priorities cost innocent lives? Or was the disaster the result of several terrible events happening at the same time? These questions have led historians to spend decades studying official documents, personal letters, government records, shipping logs, military reports, and eyewitness accounts. Some historians argue that British policy played a major role in increasing the death toll. They point to delayed food imports, transportation policies, poor communication, and decisions that placed military needs ahead of civilian relief. According to this view, the famine became much worse because of choices made by the colonial government. Other historians believe the picture is more complex. They argue that the Japanese invasion of Burma, natural disasters, wartime inflation, transportation failures, crop disease, market panic, and limited shipping all combined to create a crisis that would have been extremely difficult for any government to control during a global war. This disagreement explains why the Bengal famine remains one of the most studied events of the 20th century. New books continue to be published. Newly examined documents sometimes change historians' understanding of certain events. Different researchers often reach different conclusions even after studying many of the same records. One thing, however, is almost impossible to dispute. Millions of ordinary people suffered. Most of them were not soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, laborers, mothers, fathers, and children trying to survive another day. They had no control over military strategy, international shipping, or government policy, yet they paid the highest price. For survivors, the famine never truly ended. Many spent the rest of their lives remembering neighbors who disappeared, family members who never came home, and villages that were never rebuilt the same way again. Even today, many families in Bengal continue to pass these stories from one generation to the next. For them, the famine is not just a chapter in a history book, it is part of their family's memory. That is why the discussion around Winston Churchill remains so emotional. Around the world, many people admire him for leading Britain during one of history's darkest wars. Others believe his government failed millions of Indians during the famine. Both views continue to shape how people remember his legacy today. As more historical records become available, the debate continues. Every new piece of evidence helps historians better understand what happened, why it happened, and what lessons future generations should learn from one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. When people talk about World War II, they usually remember famous battles, powerful leaders, and historic victories. But while the world was watching tanks, fighter planes, and soldiers, another tragedy was unfolding far from the front lines. It did not happen in a battlefield. It happened in homes, villages, and crowded streets where ordinary people were simply trying to find their next meal. The Bengal famine remains one of the darkest humanitarian disasters of the 20th century because it reminds us that wars affect far more than the people carrying weapons. Decisions made in government offices can change the lives of millions who are nowhere near the fighting. After the war ended, Britain faced many questions about its actions during the famine. Researchers, journalists, and historians began collecting documents, letters, and official records to understand what had happened. Some government files remained hidden for years before becoming available to the public. As more information was studied, the debate became even stronger rather than disappearing. One of the biggest questions was simple: could more lives have been saved? Many historians believe the answer is yes. They argue that quicker action, larger food imports, better transportation, and stronger price controls could have reduced the number of deaths. According to this view, the famine became far worse because the response came too slowly. Other historians urge caution before reaching that conclusion. They point out that Britain was fighting a global war unlike anything the world had ever seen. Enemy submarines threatened shipping routes. Military supplies were desperately needed across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Governments everywhere were making impossible choices with limited resources. From this perspective, they argue that the famine was the result of many different disasters happening at the same time, rather than one single decision. This disagreement is why the Bengal famine is still discussed in universities and history books around the world. It is not simply about assigning blame, it is about understanding how governments respond during times of crisis and what happens when millions of vulnerable people depend on those decisions. The famine also had a lasting political impact on India. Many Indians believed the colonial government had failed in its responsibility to protect its people. Public anger continued to grow. Trust in British rule became weaker than ever before. Leaders of the Indian independence movement pointed to the famine as another example of why India needed to govern itself. Only a few years later, in 1947, India gained independence from British rule. Although many factors led to independence, historians agree that events like the Bengal famine shaped public opinion and strengthened demands for self-government. Today, museums, books, documentaries, and academic studies continue to examine the famine from different angles. Some focus on the economic causes, others study wartime politics, transportation failures, agricultural problems, or colonial policies. Each new generation of researchers adds another piece to the puzzle. The story also teaches an important lesson that goes beyond history.